Hey guys, this is Dr. Momsilovich with your lecture 9.1 on biogeography. So last week we discussed biomes, which were determined according to the amount of rainfall and the climate of different areas. The biome concept captures some, but not all, of the variation that we see in the distribution of organisms on the planet. So for example, depending on the amount of rainfall and the average temperature, you might have anything from a tropical rainforest to a desert to a deciduous forest. That plant life can then determine the types of animals that are able to live there and the amount of biodiversity. Biogeography takes this one step further and looks at the geographic patterns to biotic distribution, so the distribution of all living things on the planet. And so it takes into account the location of the globe, the way that continents move through tectonic activities, different things like that. And so this picture here is of a numbat, which is a small marsupial that lives in Australia. And based on its location in Australia, the different constraints it's had to evolve under, how it got there, all of those different things are what biogeography is concerned with. And this is, because of that, this is a really, really big area of biology. You could actually spend an entire class in one semester looking at all of the different aspects of biogeography, but we're only going to cover it in two lectures. So to start, we're going to talk about a scientist named Alfred Russel Wallace. Wallace traveled extensively in the Malay archipelago, and he noticed there were very different patterns in the distribution of organisms between the islands of Bali and Lombok. So Bali and Lombok are only about 35 kilometers apart, but the differences he could see between those two islands couldn't be explained by geology or climate. And so when he looked closer at the different flora and fauna on those two islands, he noticed that the biota on Lombok were more similar to Australia, and the biota on Bali were more similar to Sumatra, Java, and Borneo. And so this line, an imaginary line, has been put between the two islands. It's known as Wallace's line, and it denotes a separation in these two areas that have had different paths in evolution, and therefore the species that live in those areas are different from each other despite their proximity. Many organisms actually have disjunct distributions across the Malay archipelago. One example is the Astrophonae frogs, which only occur on the eastern part of the Malay archipelago and not on the western part, even though a lot of the islands are very close. In the western part, you have other types of frogs, such as the Gastrophonoides, and so it is observations such as this that have prompted some of these questions in biogeography, and how do different species get to different parts of the planet, and how do they evolve in those different areas. One large-scale pattern that we can see in biogeography is that there are latitudinal gradients in the amount of taxa, or the species richness, according to your latitude on the planet. So close to the equator, you have a greater species richness, and as you move further and further towards the poles, that species richness drops. And this is due to both evolutionary history and climate. So areas near the poles are going to get lots of warm temperatures that are good for growing, as well as lots of sunlight. They get lots of rainfall year round. and they haven't gone through quite as many changes in their climates as areas that are further away from the tropics, where there has been more glaciation and different changes going on. The areas towards the equator have had a longer evolutionary history that has allowed for that diversity to expand, as well as temperatures and climate that are conducive to having a lot of different species in the same area at the same time. In addition to latitudinal effects, there are also area effects, where you would expect to find more species in a larger area. So if we were to think about think about the size of your backyard perhaps. If you think about the number of species of arthropods in your backyard, that's going to be a relatively small number, especially depending on how large the backyard at your home is. If we then expand it to your neighborhood, you would expect even more species. If we expand it to your town, you would expect more species within that area. If we expand it to the county or the state, as you increase the area, you expect to find more and more different species. Along what we call a species area curve, there will eventually be a somewhat slowing down of the number of species that we add as we add area. And so that equation is the one in the middle of your screen, where S is the number of species, and that is equal to C, which is a constant, times the area, times, or to the power of Z, which is the slope, and it's usually between 0.2 and 0.4. But we can use both latitudinal gradients and area effects for ecologists to look at different areas and determine whether or not those places seem to be healthy and thriving, or whether there seem to be some negative effects of maybe human activities or some other type of pollutant that is affecting the biodiversity of that area. On the planet, there are different biogeographic regions, and these regions are separated by barriers such as mountains, oceans, deserts, things like that, that don't allow dispersal of plants and animals between those different regions. And there's a few of them that I'd like you to know, so we're going to go over those in a little bit more detail. The first is the Nearctic, which is shown in green here, so that would be Canada, the United States, most of Mexico, and Greenland. And that is biogeographically separated from the Neotropic region, which is southern Mexico, Central America, the Caribbean, and South America. So up until about 3 to 3.5 million years ago, North America and South America were completely separate, separated from each other. Those two did join together when the Isthmus of Panama formed, but when we look at the different species in North America and Central and South America, there is a very big change and a very big distinction between those two groups of animals and plants, because they evolved completely separately, and only within the past few million years have they been able to intermingle. And so there has been a little bit of exchange of organisms between the two areas, but when you look at them, they actually are very, very different in their plants and animals from each other. The next area is the Palearctic, which is shown here in red. So this would be Northern Africa, Europe, and most of Asia. That is separated from the Afrotropic region, which is in blue, so that would be the Central and Southern Africa. It is separated by essentially the Saharan desert from, so the Palearctic and the Afrotropic are separated by desert. And then the Palearctic is separated from the Indo-Malayan region, which is shown in sort of a brownish color, and it would be India, as well as some of those other southern Asian countries and Malaysia. And so India was its own sort of little continent floating in the ocean on its own tectonic plate until it ran into the Palearctic part of this biogeographic region millions and millions of years ago. And India is still moving up towards that Palearctic region, and they're separated from each other by the Himalayan mountains. So this is where like Mount Everest is, for example. So they're separated, in this case, by mountains. The last one is the Australasian biogeographic region. So this would be Australia, New Zealand, New Guinea, those areas. And that is separated from Malaysia by that Wallace's line that we've talked about. So Australia is on its own tectonic plate and has been moving around on the planet separately from a lot of these other continents, but it is pushing very slowly northward into that Indo-Malaysian area. And so it is separated by the fact that it is not on the same plate as those other areas, and that is why we see those different species between anything that's on that Australian plate versus the one that's on the Indo-Malaysian. When we're talking about biogeography, we can also talk about different types of species. And so any species that is only found in a certain region is called an endemic species, meaning that it is only found in that area. So in this example, we have the island of Socotra, which is sort of between Africa and the Middle East. And it's an island that has several species that are endemic to that island. So it has a type of tree, a specific type of, or specific species of chameleon, as well as a songbird that is similar to a hummingbird that's very small. And those species are only found on that one island off the coast of Africa. And so they are endemic to Socotra. Biogeography is a field of biology that has only really come about in the past 40 or so years. And we are only able to make hypotheses and observations on some of these ideas of biogeography because of a few scientific advances that have occurred in the past 30, 40, 50, 60 years. So the first is the acceptance of the theory of continental drift. So we now understand that the continents are located on plates that move around on the planet, and that the location of those plates has changed quite a bit over the entire history of the Earth. If you had gone to college back in the 20s or 30s or 40s, the 1920s or 30s or 40s, by the way, you would have been taught this idea as a hypothesis, but we didn't have any good tests of this idea or fully understand the mechanics. Now that we do understand the way that the continents and the plates move around the planet, and we have a better idea of how they have moved in the history of the Earth, we can start using that to be able to look at the distribution of different species on the planet. The second major development is phylogenetic taxonomy. So this is using genetics to look at the relationships between different species. And the field of genetics really only came about in the 1980s. So it's very, very new, but it's a very powerful tool, and it's becoming more powerful because we can do a lot of these tests very quickly now and get a lot of amazing data to show us the relationships between different species. We also have had the development relatively recently of the theory of island biogeography, which we'll talk more in detail about next time. So biogeography as a whole is a really, really diverse study of all of these different things because it takes into account physical things such as the continents moving. It takes into account genetics, as well as theoretical ecology, which is that theory of island biogeography. So let's talk about these different aspects of biogeography in a little bit more detail. So the first one being continental drift. The lithosphere is the rocky part of the Earth, and the crust is and the upper mantle are the solid parts of our planet Earth. Those are separated into tectonic plates, and those plates are able to move around the surface of the planet on top of that molten part that is located underneath those plates. The density and the type of rock determines whether the plate is an oceanic or a continental plate. So if it's denser and heavier, it's going to be at the bottom of an ocean. If it's lighter, it's going to be at the top and be part of a continent. Mountain chains occur where two tectonic plates collide. So if they're colliding and pushing up into each other, you have something like the Himalayas, where part of that Palearctic plate and part of the Indian plate are pushing against each other and causing those mountains to go up. You can also have mountains occur in subduction zones, such as what we see in the Andes, which are volcanic, where you have the plate that's going underneath the other one gets sucked down and liquefied, and we create lava. And so we end up with volcanic mountains in areas with subduction zones. So because the Earth's crust isn't composed of fixed ocean basins and continents, it's instead made up of those plates. They're able to move around the planet, and that changes the way that the land masses and the oceans are distributed on the planet. So if you think back to when we talked about allopatric speciation, which is speciation that occurs because of a physical barrier, as these different continents moved around the planet, it's changing the distribution of different species. It's changing their location. It's changing whether they are combined with another population or whether they are separate from them. And so if we look at what our land masses look like during the Permian, it was a big chunk of land on the planet. Over time, those land masses broke up. So if you had a species that lived on that large landmass called Pangea, as it broke up, the different populations of those species got pulled to different areas of the planet. And as they moved, they were subjected to different climates, different latitudes, other species, and they had to evolve separately because they had different constraints and different evolutionary processes going on. And so we now know that continental drift is actually an incredibly important part of determining the distribution of species on the planet, as well as determining how those species have evolved over time. In the past 50 to 100 years, we've actually gotten quite a bit of evidence that continental drift is happening. And one of those areas is in marine geology. So in the 1950s, the mid-ocean ridges were mapped, and they were able to mark the locations of places where the seafloor is spreading. So these are places where those tectonic plates, those oceanic plates, in some locations are moving apart. And some of this data and this information came from the invention of submarines, which were used during World War II, and were using sonar to be able to detect other things in their environment, and they were seeing these very, very deep parts of the ocean, and because of that, scientists were able to use some of that information to start determining where those oceanic plates were and where they met. So for you guys, I only want you to know one oceanic ridge, which is the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, which separates North and South America from Africa and Europe. And that mid-oceanic ridge is a place where those two oceanic plates are moving away from each other. We also have geologic evidence for continental drift. So we can see this in mountains and ocean ridges and rocks with the same strata, which are layers of deposition, in both South America and Africa. So if you've ever looked at those two continents, they actually fit together pretty well, and you can see where they would have pulled apart from each other. And there are different rock formations on those two continents that actually match each other. So one are called cratons, which are areas of massive amounts of lava flow, and the age and type match between Africa and South America. There are also swarms of dikes, which are rocky intrusions, and the type and age of those also match between South America and Africa. So we can use evidence like rock type and age and things like that to determine that different parts of the world that are now separated by thousands of kilometers used to be very close together and connected. More evidence for continental drift comes from paleoclimate evidence, which is evidence of glaciation. So at one point in the history of the Earth, South America, Africa, India, Antarctica, and Australia were all combined together towards the South Pole as part of a continent called Gondwanaland. And if you think about the South Pole, what you know is that it's covered in ice. And in the wintertime, that sheet of ice, that glacier, expands and grows, and during the summertime it shrinks. When that ice is growing and moving outwards, it rolls rocks that are trapped in the bottom of the ice along the surface of the earth, and it leaves these long streaks of scars. And when it contracts, those rocks get pulled back inwards. And you can actually see the scars of those glaciers moving along the surface of the earth. And when we look at it, we can see those scars that match in parts of all of those continents, and you can see how they were all connected and how those scars match up to indicate the expansion and contraction of glaciers when all of those different continents were located at the South Pole. And so we can use evidence like this to show that all of these different continents were connected together at one point in time. We can also get evidence for continental drift through paleontology, where we see anomalies in the fossil record that we can only resolve when we view them in the context of continental drift. So for example, we have the Mesosaurus, fossils of the Mesosaurus that we find in both South America and Southern Africa. And we also see fossils for other species, such as a plant known as Glossopteris, which there are fossils for in Australia, Antarctica, India, Madagascar, Africa, and South America. And the climate of those places does not support or would not support the those different species at this point in time. And so if we think about it from an idea of continental drift and that the distributions of them are found along all of these different continents, it makes sense that they all used to be connected. And that's why we see fossils that are at the same level in the strata or the different rock layers and are found, if we date them back at the same time, that they were that their distributions occurred when this was all one continent known as Gondwana land. More evidence comes from paleomagnetism. So when rocks form from magma, iron oxide particles become magnetized as the rock cools, and they orient according to the magnetic field of the planet. Occasionally, the Earth's magnetic field reverses. It reverses direction, and those reversals are recorded in the rocks. So in particular, we can see this at the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, where the two plates between North America and Europe are pulling apart from each other. And at the points in time where those reversals have occurred, the magma cools and the iron oxides are oriented and then solidified in that orientation. And so we can see these sections of those oceanic plates where you have the iron oxides oriented in different directions, and they match up as mirror images of each other on either side of that oceanic plate. And so it's just further evidence that through the history of the Earth, those two plates have been moving apart from each other. We can also use phylogenetic taxonomy, where we take the methods of phylogenetics and we apply them to biogeographical questions. So in this instance, we would take a phylogenetic tree that we build based on genetic information, and we transform it into an area phylogeny where we replace the name of the taxa with the place where the taxa live or lived. So if we take the example of horses and everything that we put into that category of horses, there's different species of zebras, different types of asses, horses, onagers, different things like that fall into the horse category. We can see that the ancestors of horses dispersed, they evolved first in North America and then dispersed into Asia and then into Africa. So something like a zebra that we think of as being a representative of an African species, its ancestors actually evolved in North America. And so the phylogenetic tree would look something like this, where we would take the names of the different species, such as horses and onagers and different types of zebras, and we replace it with where they evolved. So the ancestral horses had their origin in North America, and then we can tell through that phylogenetic taxonomy that they moved into Asia and then down into Africa. And so it's not until the past 2 to 2.5 million years ago that zebras, or the original zebras, the horse ancestors of zebras, moved into Africa and then speciated into zebras there. So we can infer that zebras diversified within Africa. There's a few different types of zebras, but their ancestors came from North America. There are two major processes that generate biogeographic patterns, and we're able to see them because of disparities between the distributions of different species. So the first one is called vicariance, and this is where you have the appearance of a physical barrier that splits the range of a species. So this is essentially what causes allopatric speciation. It's where you have, because of continental drift, either a body of water occurring between two populations or a mountain range, something that this species cannot overcome, and therefore the populations are split and they evolve separately. The other type of process is called dispersal. And so this is what happens if an organism crosses a barrier and is able to establish a population in an area where it is disparate from the original population. And both of these processes result in discontinuous ranges for species. So we're going to look at these in a little bit more detail. So an example of a vicariance event is something that we've actually talked about before when we talked about allopatric speciation. where we had, before North and South America joined together because of the Isthmus of Panama, the Pacific and the Atlantic Oceans were combined. When that Isthmus of Panama formed, we ended up with a separation of species onto either side of that isthmus. And aquatic creatures are not able to crawl over the land and reach each other on either side. And so the species on the Atlantic side had separate evolution from the ones on the Pacific side. In shrimp of the genus Alpheus, there ended up being shrimp that evolved separately in either of those two oceans, and through random effects, one of them ended up with a right claw, and the other one ended up with a left claw, and they are now, over the process of evolution during the past 3 million years, they have become completely separate species, but we know that they did used to be joined into one species. So that takes us to our first example of a dispersal event. So this is when can happen when land masses come together, and we have two different biotas merging so that we have biotic interchange. So when that Isthmus of Panama formed 3 to 4 million years ago, it joined North and South America, which had been separate from each other for about 65 million years. So that's a long time for evolution to be acting on those different groups of mammals and for them to have evolved completely separately. When that Isthmus of Panama merged, there was a little bit of a movement and a little bit of biotic interchange between that northern section of America and South America. So possums were able to move from South America up into North America, and they're the only marsupial that occurs in North America. On the reverse, we have vicunas, which move from North America to South America. Vicunas are a camelid, so the ancestors of camels evolved in North America, and vicunas were able to move down into South America. They're related to things like alpacas and llamas. And typically we think of alpacas and llamas and vicunas as being very typical South American species, but they were not even in South America until about 3 or so million years ago when North and South America joined together. The second example of a dispersal event occurred when we had a land bridge between North America and Asia, and this occurred about 2 million to 10,000 years ago during the Pleistocene. So during this period, it was actually a very, very important migration event that happened, where we had the movement from Asia to North America of humans, which have persisted, lions, so this would be things like saber-tooths that have gone extinct, as well as mammoths that moved into North America and have also gone extinct. But they moved from Asia into North America. From there, humans were able to move throughout North America and then down into South America. And we can look at the genetics of the native peoples of the two Americas and see that their genetics came from Asia, and that those people moved over into the Americas between 1.8 and 10,000 years ago. There were a few other smaller events of humans moving to the Americas over the oceans, but the majority of the genetics from native peoples from the two Americas come from those Asian ancestors that moved here very recently in the history of the Earth. There was also an important move of horses and camels from North America over into Asia. So horses and camels evolved first in North America and then moved over into Asia and then into Africa through that formation of a land bridge on the Bering Strait.